You're listening to Rhythms of Grace, a podcast of Grace Fellowship Church in McClenny, Florida, with pastors Nathaniel Simmons and Joel Griffiths. To find out more about Grace Fellowship Church, visit www.gfcbaker.org. Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of Rhythms of Grace. I'm Joel Griffiths, and I'm joined, as always, by the Reverend Dr. Nathaniel Simmons. And we got a lot we're going to talk about today, but first we wanted to introduce another special guest we're going to have on for a minute here, and that is Miss June Simmons. So welcome, June.
June has always wanted to be a celebrity on a nationally syndicated podcast.
No, I haven't.
So I said, June, why don't you come in and wave to everybody and say hi? Why don't you do it, June? Wave and say hi. June, we're going to talk in a second about books we're reading. What book are you reading right now?
I'm reading Series of Unfortunate Events, The Vile Village.
The Vile Village.
The Vile Village. I can't remember what number that is.
What number is that?
I think it's 7.
I think that is book 7.
Wow.
That is book 7. So, but you already read today, so now you don't have to go read anymore. She did her daily reading already.
Very good.
I didn't realize that it's not afternoon yet.
We also read Dr. Seuss last night. So
Always
we might
good.
do a little bit more Dr. Seuss today.
Always
All right,
good.
I'm gonna let you go. See you, babe.
Bye, June.
All right, it's nice to make her feel famous.
Yeah.
Will you shut the door on the way out? Thanks.
All right.
Love
it. Well, that was adorable.
Yeah. Hey, we've taken 2 weeks off because you went to the beach, and then
you went to the beach.
What beach did y'all go
how'd you
to?
like the beach? We went to St. Augustine Beach.
With Abby's family?
With Abby's family, yep.
We went to Emerald Isle in North Carolina with my family.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever been to a beach outside the state of Florida, but I've always heard of them and known they existed.
Yeah, they actually exist. It's not just a fairy tale. Emerald Isle is kind of interesting because the way North Carolina is shaped, it sort of curves out. So there's an island along the coast of North Carolina, but it actually, instead of facing the east, it faces the south because of the way it curves. So the sun rises and sets almost along the coastline. So you watch the sun, instead of rising from the other side of the ocean and going to the land, it's just crossing the ocean at night. Not exactly, it's not a perfectly south-facing thing, but it is. It's really pretty. We had tons of blood moons, which we'll talk about today, but really, really red moons.
Signs of the times.
Yeah, it was beautiful. We kept thinking, look up, for your redemption is nigh.
Amen. Well, how about we do another quick segment on the books we're reading, or whatever it is you might be reading these days. Usually it's books, but maybe it could be other things.
You usually read a lot of things at the same time, and I don't usually, but I am right now. I'm pulling a page out of your book. Mm-hmm. So you want to start? What are you reading?
Sure. I have probably for the last 3 years now been kind of on and off, slowly reading through Les Mis, unabridged. So that's why it's taken so long. And I love it. It's very long, very bloated at times. I mean, it's known for just having all these digressions that the author goes on, and they don't seem connected to the plot at all, though they may be and are. But it's a very long book, and lots of names and places and historical references that honestly just go right over my head. But I've been plowing through it, and there are a lot of really, really beautiful and dramatic parts of it too. So it's been a marathon, but I am starting to close in on it now. So yeah.
I started that book years ago and made it like 2/3 of the way through. Something happened and I stopped, and it's been years. So I feel like if I started again, I'd have to start at the beginning. I remember it's my favorite musical. It's probably my favorite movie. I love the story of Les Mis. And I remember thinking that the book is way slower.
Mm-hmm.
There are parts that I think are even more beautiful. And there are other parts that I think, well, you just got to get through this part, you know?
Yeah.
I remember some of the writings of the priest who gives them the silver. I remember really loving that scene in Les Mis, in the actual book. But it's been so long I couldn't quote it.
Yeah.
So you're reading Les Mis?
Reading Les Mis. I'm also reading a sermon by Jonathan Edwards called Heaven, a World of Love, which I wanted to read that one because Jonathan Edwards, I remember reading it in seminary actually and being very struck by it because Jonathan Edwards is a preacher from the 1700s that is most famously known for his sermon called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, which was like a pretty terrifying sermon about the realities of hell and judgment. And but also he preached sermons that were about the beauty and the glory of heaven. And so I wanted to read that. He has so many just good reflections on heaven and how if love is the chief fruit of the Spirit, then that must mean that heaven is a world that's absolutely full of love to the greatest degree.
Yeah, I think that's interesting because of the juxtaposition of the way people think of him.
Yeah.
And so, and even that once, I mean, the reality is, in my opinion, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God is pretty hard hat, and actually is surprisingly, the gospel isn't quite as clear in it as I would have expected from him. It's interesting how that became the definitive sermon that he's known by, where I don't know if it really is capturing of his overall writing as I've seen him writing in other places. Fun. Okay.
How about you?
At the beach, I finished A Land Remembered, which is kind of, it's a fictional book, but it's the settling of Florida, and I loved it. And then I started on audiobook The Count of Monte Cristo. I think I finished chapter 17, maybe chapter 18 last night, and I still have, like, according to the audiobook, 49 hours left to go. So I think I've done about 10 hours of listening to that, and I have about 49 left. It is long.
That's awesome. I've always heard Count of Monte Cristo is excellent, though, and that, especially for an old book, it bears a lot of resemblance to modern novels in how it's written.
It is. I'm doing the Amazon Classics reading of it, and so it's nice because it's on Audible, but I can, if I want, I can just listen, and it's a good audio recording. I can also listen and read at the same time, but it tracks with the Kindle book, so I can go back and forth between reading and listening.
I like that.
The reader is really punchy, and at first I was like, this is kind of, it's not smooth, but as I've really grown to think he's very easy to listen to. I've actually liked him. Like you said about the Les Mis, there's a lot I don't know about French history. It's set in, Napoleon is exiled and then he comes back, and then Waterloo happens, and I don't know that history all that well. So I need to go do a Napoleon biography to get caught up on that. But I feel like that's going to fade into the background a little bit now. But it's been really heavy on the front side, and I don't know French geography at all. So, but that said, I really like the book so far.
Yeah.
Just last night, there was a little bit of him. He gets locked into prison, and he's in solitary confinement for a long time. And he begins talking about solitary confinement in a way that almost is like a metaphor for hell itself. But that's where he learns to pray. And he's like, before he's kind of pray, but he had to get to a point where he didn't have hope in anybody else before he really began to pray to God. And so there's certain things like that in some of this old writing that,
they were faith-filled.
Yeah, it was just really interesting. That I'm like, yeah, I see it.
I mean,
clearly,
Les Mis
somebody
is that way.
is a Christian or steeped in Christian thinking has written this book because they understand the theological way that we would talk about sin separates people from God and from each other. So he sees solitary confinement in prison as metaphoric of hell itself. Well, there's just a whole theology wrapped up in his mind that he assumes people just pick up on that. And I think it's kind of fun.
Yeah. I love it. It's great.
I'm also reading, let's see, what else am I reading? Oh, I started a book called Kingdom Come, which will be relevant to some other conversations we're having on. So you and I, because of chapter 21, started talking about different end times views, premillennialism, amillennialism, things like that. We'll talk about that more in a bit. But both of us said we wanted to do a little bit more reading on that. And so I picked up Sam Storm's book, which is basically a defense of amillennialism. And I'm actually planning on doing I started doing a little bit of a review of that I'll at least share with you, and we'll see if it's any good. Maybe I'll share a book review of that with people.
Yeah, that's great. I wanted to read that myself, actually, and I haven't, but I have another amillennialism book by Kim Riddlebarger, which is pretty good too. I dipped into some of that recently as we were having our discussions.
I've been told it is Kim Riddlebarger's is kind of more on the academic but great side. Sam Storm's book is very accessible and easy to read. And I found that his experience with dispensationalism, he grew up as a dispensationalist, which maybe we'll talk about that more later, but so did I. And so I feel that I can relate with a lot of what he's saying on a very personal level. It reads like a friend talking to a friend about, hey, isn't this your experience with end times? And this is my experience. And so there's kind of a colloquial way. That's not the right word, but I found it easy and accessible in that sense.
Personable.
Yep. And then I'm reading the series of unfortunate events along with the girls.
Fun.
So that's what I'm in.
Very good. Well, you had another segment too you wanted to dip into today, so tell them what it is.
I'm meeting
and go
with
for
a
it.
guy at our church to go through Discipleship Essentials, which is a book by Greg Ogden, and that's been fun. But in that conversation this morning, he brought up the Proverbs, and he says, somebody told me that we should be reading the Proverbs more regularly. He says, I noticed that we don't read it a lot at our church, and there's never been a sermon on them. And so we just started talking about why that is, and how we could supplement that. First off, let me ask you, have you ever preached a sermon on Proverbs?
No, and I think it's the kind of book that doesn't lend itself super well to sermons, at least sermons and how we typically preach them, like selecting a passage and working through it verse by verse. And so the way I've typically viewed Proverbs is that they are great small tidbits to kind of sprinkle into whatever you are preaching. And I do find that they often are relevant. If I'm listening out for it and paying attention, it's not too hard to find a proverb that will be relevant to whatever passage I'm preaching. So I haven't done a great job of that, of trying to bring some of those in and sprinkle them into my messages, but that's generally how I've viewed them.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. I would like to do more. It seems to me clear that growing in wisdom is a major theme in Proverbs and in the Bible in general. In the way Proverbs sort of teaches us to grow in wisdom. Sometimes there's big chunks of thematic material that's related, but sometimes it seems like an invitation to take a pithy or wise saying and just to chew on it and to think about it and allow meditation on wise sayings to soak into you until you are able to apply it into your life. And I don't know. I find that really helpful and good, that like if you want to get wise, you have to have solid intake of good ideas, and you can, I think the short pithiness of it means it's not lending itself to long expositions. It's lending itself to just processing it throughout the day, get it in your head, memorize it, find ways in which it applies to things in your life until you've allowed this idea to become part of your value system.
Yeah, and the way that they are arranged in Proverbs is such that one just kind of is set alongside of another. It's not all, you can probably group them thematically if you kind of look at it, but usually it's just kind of, here's a thought about this subject and here's a thought about another subject. There's not a clear logical thread going from one to another.
Especially in the
just how they
second
are.
half. I think the second half of Proverbs is way more that way. The first half, they do seem to be a little bit more related. And then as it goes on, they just become statements. Now, all right. So anyway, that was a way of saying, I think it might be fun for us to do a proverb and just a short reflection on one. But the one we talked about in our time together with that guy that I'm doing Discipleship Essentials with was from Proverbs chapter 22. And we talked about 1 through 3. And I asked the question to him, do you think they're related, or are they just 3 random things? And I think that they all stand alone, but they also are kind of related. So let me read them to you, and we'll talk about them for just a minute or two. It says, a good name is to be chosen rather than great riches, and favor is better than silver or gold. The rich and poor meet together. The Lord is the maker of them all. The prudent sees danger, and he hides himself, but the simple go on and suffer for it. And so we just stopped there. I'm sure that if we kept reading, we could find other connections. But of those things, I saw a theme there that the theme seems to be about mostly making wise choices that consider the end, and you let the end of what's going to happen if I choose this or that, and you let that consideration drive your decision making. So the simple person, the prudent person sees danger and he hides himself. He's like, if I go this way, that could go wrong for me. The simple person doesn't think ahead. He just lives. I just live my life. I don't think ahead. And then to play that out, it seems like the first 2 verses have this idea of money involved. So he says, some people live for silver or gold. Who cares? What you should live for is a good name. Because in verse 2, the rich and the poor, they're going to meet together. And I told him, I said, I think that means when they die, they're going to stand in the same place. It doesn't matter if you're rich or if you're poor. When you die, you stand before the Lord. He made the rich and the poor, and he's not going to care how much money is in your bank account. Yeah. And so live today for a good name or honor when you stand before the Lord. The prudent person says, one day I will die. I will stand before the Lord, the maker of them all, and I make decisions today in light of that. The simple person just says, I'll make money today and have fun today, and who cares about tomorrow? That's the basic way I see that.
Yeah, that's great. It's a statement of what you value and valuing the right things. Obviously, it's natural for people to value great riches and silver or gold, but there are things more valuable than that to live for.
Yeah. I think if you're trying to apply this or meditate on it, there's a million different ways in which you can see people who deny a immediate good in pursuit of a better thing, a long-term thing. And he says, wise people see bad things to avoid and good things to pursue. Simple people just live. So be wise. And so what good things should you pursue? Ultimately, it is a good name, or even more ultimately than that, it is a right standing before God when you stand before your maker. I think that's helpful. That's good.
Very good. Very good. Good dose of wisdom from Proverbs today.
It would be interesting to try to preach that as a sermon, because I think the principle is clear so quickly that we would do a lot of illustrating, I think. Yeah. But
you could
there's a lot of ways you can apply it, though.
Dip into other parts of Scripture that have things to say to us about riches and the deceitfulness of riches.
Yeah.
Because, there's a lot there.
I think we could even go to where we were. That would have been a great parallel passage, actually, for the scribes and the Pharisees who loved to be seen, and they gave their big money. And then there was this widow who gave her 2 mites, and both of them stand before God. And it's not the rich that stood well before him.
I always think about how a huge part, perhaps the majority of Jesus's life, is summed up in one verse in Luke that says he grew in favor with God and with man. Just thinking about that idea of favor, that Jesus lived in such a way that he grew in favor. He had a good name, a good reputation, primarily favor with God, but also leading from that favor with man. Because when you love people the way that God tells you to, that tends to make you grow in favor with man also.
That's right. All right. So those were 3 little introductions.
Yeah. So today we are going to talk a little bit about the Olivet Discourse, which is just kind of the term that has been applied to the passage that we're currently in the Gospel of Luke in our preaching series through Luke. And we used to do this on the podcast a lot. It was our usual format to discuss whatever the sermon was the previous week, and we did that every week. And we kind of moved on from that to do a more topical approach. But in this case, I think where we are in the Gospel of Luke is a passage that has so much topical interest because it's connected to eschatology, or our doctrine of the end times, which is one of those topics that it always seems to have interest surrounding it. And I think that's for good reasons. And so I preached on the first part, more or less the first half of Luke 21, the Olivet Discourse, as Luke refers to it, although there's a parallel passage in Matthew 24 and also Mark 13. So I preached from that this past Sunday, and Nathaniel heard it and thought, oh, you know what, I better do this again. No, not really. He's going to take the second half of it, and hopefully, Nathaniel, I set you up well and okay for where you want to go in the rest of the passage. But that's going to be our topic today, and you are prepping this week to do the rest of that passage, and so I figured we could take the opportunity to just sort of talk about anything that came up from my message, but also talk about anything to kind of preview or look ahead for as it comes to your message. So, what do you think?
No, that's right. Well, first off, I basically agreed with everything you said in your sermon. So it's nice that I don't have to say, well, I know Joel said this, but I think this.
Yeah. Well, that's good to know.
I do believe one thing that I've appreciated about you is that in our relationship, I do think that we're able to disagree about things in Scripture and disagree as like friends and brothers, and it's okay that we don't always see eye to eye and everything. And sometimes I want to make those things transparent for people when we don't agree as friends, so you can say, I think that there is a healthy way to debate each other and grow by pushing back and forth on each other without being like, you don't agree with me, then you're not really a Christian. So I think that's good. But in this case, I think you and I see things basically the same, and I don't know that this will be one of those places where we disagree a lot. However, I think you and I both grew up in a place where we view the passage at least a little differently than what we heard a lot in sermons growing up. So I thought part of the reason why this might be helpful to talk about is because it gives us an opportunity to say, well, this is what we heard and this is what's different. And I'm assuming a lot of people in our church were like, yeah, I followed everything he said, but as you're trying to think back in history and like, what did I learn growing up and what did I think?
Yeah, and
what's the same? What's different? And it doesn't mean that you have to agree with us here if we're different than what you have always thought or were thinking, but at least to maybe kind of organize thoughts and see what do some people say, what do I think, and what do they think? And so just try to be a little bit more, when you preach, you're more declaring what you believe and trying to explain it. But in something like this, we can lay ideas side by side a little bit and compare them.
I agree. And I kind of hate the old cliche of people like to say, we're all on a journey, but I think there is truth to it in a topic like this. Like, I think there should be humility involved in whatever conclusion we might come to, or whatever way we might lean. That may be the most we're able to say on an issue like this is, I tend to view it this way, or I lean toward this way, but I could be wrong. I don't think there is anything wrong with letting that be kind of where you stand. And it's probably best in my mind.
C.S. Lewis has some quote about being on a journey, and he says people will say that and say something to the effect that it's not the destination, it's the journey that matters. And he says, that's stupid. If you are walking aimlessly, then you're not on a journey. You're lost. You're wandering. Yeah. It is true that the journey is formative. It makes you, and that you are shaped along the way of the journey. But unless you're trying to go somewhere, then it's a waste of your time. So I think that we want to understand the text better. We want to be as obedient as possible. We're okay saying that we may not be at our final destination, but we are walking toward a better understanding to the best of our ability. We're walking to a more clear understanding of the text.
It's not just about the friends we made along the way.
That's right. All right. So you did a really good job in your sermon of saying that essentially the question that is being asked in the debates is how much of this passage is talking about. So everybody agrees when Jesus is talking, he's talking about a future event from his perspective.
Yes.
The question that seems to be largely divisive is, from our perspective, is he talking about a past event or a future event or some combination of the two?
How future was he talking?
Right.
How much in the future?
Future for him, of course, but was it near future for him or was it distant future, even future for us? And the terms you use, I don't know if you said these terms, but generally speaking, it is a futurist reading or a preterist reading.
I didn't use the terms, but I think it's, in this context of the podcast, it's good to talk about whatever terms like that we want and kind of go in more depth, or give people those little tools they can use to more easily discuss these kinds of things. I think that's the main value of little terms and shorthand like that.
I can't remember what the word preterist, I can't remember word origin for that. Do you?
I see the prefix pre on the front of it, so but I don't know.
Preterist, whatever. So anyway, essentially the word preterist, tell me if this is right, means it wasn't a past tense, it was a future tense then, but it's past tense now.
Right, yeah. Right? It's something that was future at the time Jesus said it, but it had a fulfillment in history at some point that we can look back to now historically and say that was the fulfillment of what Jesus said. That's the preterist view. And usually we're talking about, and you can take preterism into the book of Revelation as well, and depending on your eschatological view, you may do that. But that's kind of, and that when you get in Revelation, we had a podcast about that years ago, I think, of the four ways of approaching the book of Revelation, one being a preterist, another being a futurist. So those two come into play there, but then there's more terms in Revelation which we won't get to. But yeah, that idea is that these were things that were future at the time they were spoken, future prophecies, but have since been fulfilled historically.
All right. So if you were coming at this, let's start with the futurist view. If you were coming at this as a futurist, what is Luke 21 mostly about?
Well, I'm trying to think in terms of those I know who are futurists. We talked before we hit record today. We talked a little bit about John MacArthur, and he would fall into this camp. It still seems to me like futurists will, in some way, at least give a nod to the fact that the temple was destroyed in 70
Yeah.
AD, and that this was a prophecy that was in reference to that on some level. But then it tends to be a matter of what you give the emphasis to as you go on. So is it just about that? A futurist would say, absolutely not. It has more to do with the end times and the great tribulation that the Bible speaks of in other places. Well, the word tribulation, I think, is used here, or at least in one of the parallel passages. And so that tends to be kind of and we've all seen Left Behind or read the books. I say we all have, but a lot of people have. And that was a very popular thing, eschatology in the 80s and 90s, and still is today. And, it's easy when you read some things like this in the Bible to sort of naturally connect it to those things that you've heard on a more popular level, or maybe from a study of eschatology that you sat in on one time. But yeah, it's just a matter of asking, to what degree is Jesus talking about things that would happen shortly after he said them? And to what degree is there something else that's going on, some other way that this passage is relevant to a more future reality, and one that's even future still in our own day?
Yeah. Yeah, just to kind of reiterate that, I do think John MacArthur is one famous futurist person. It's not fair to say exclusively, but I would say most of us who have heard a futurist position have heard it from the perspective called dispensationalism, which is reflected in the Left Behind series, like you said. So just a real quick history there. In the sort of late 1800s, early 1900s, you have John Nelson Darby, who is a Plymouth Brethren guy. I think that I'm remembering that correctly. And he develops at least the framework of dispensational theology. Is picked up by C.I. Scofield. And the Scofield Study Bible was one of the first, most popular study Bibles that everybody got. And he laid out a very futurist view of these passages and the Revelation and things like that. And then that became, I don't know if you can hear that or not. I thought I silenced all that.
You take that if you need to.
Nah. So anyway, I'm silencing it now. One of the cool thing about an Apple Watch is you can silence everything on your watch.
Oh, wow.
We'll see if it works.
High tech.
I do that every time Sunday morning starts. About somewhere in the middle of the first song, I think, I need to silence everything, and I just look down at my watch. And like when it gets to full on James Bond, I'll be like, and I'll whisper to my watch. Do something.
There's a really funny clip of John Piper preaching, and he's being real animated with his hands and everything, and then you kind of hear some little beep go off, and he stops and he looks and he says something like, "My watch thinks I'm having a health episode right now."
You just fell or something. So anyway, it's a position that has grown up because of the Scofield Bible, and a lot of people, especially in the circles that I grew up in, would have been you had Hal Lindsey's The Late Great Planet Earth was a really popular thing. You had the Scofield Bible, the Ryrie Study Bible was another really big one, Charles Ryrie, Louis Berry Chafer, Dallas Theological Seminary. These are all streams of influence that made the dispensational view, futurist view, very, very popular in the circles that I grew up in, and probably in the circles that you grew up in as well. The way they describe what's going to happen in the future is that we're living in a time that they call the church age, or the age of the Gentiles, that comes in this passage, and that at the end of that age, there will be a rapture of the church and a 7-year tribulation period. And a lot of this passage is talking about the signs that will predate that 7-year tribulation period. It predates the rapture. The rapture happens, and then some of this is fulfilled mostly right before the rapture and the tribulation. Some of it may be in the tribulation. and it predates the second coming of Jesus Christ, which they would say happens at the end of that 7-year tribulation. And then that would set up a millennial reign, a 1,000-year reign of Jesus. That was the primary way I read that growing up, or was taught this. You mentioned that a lot of them saw some temple fulfillment in there.
Mm-hmm.
But I know, like, I spent a lot of time reading John MacArthur yesterday just to make sure that I was representing him right and remembering him correctly.
Yeah.
I think that it is fair to say that he views the temple as something that the disciples bring up, but it's a launching point for Jesus to go beyond that. So that they see the temple and they think, this is awesome, the temple's great, we want to ask you about the temple. And Jesus says, yeah, that temple's coming down. And they say, well, tell us about that. And Jesus says, oh, I'll tell you about that and more. I'm going to tell you about what's going to happen before the whole system comes down and the tribulation begins, the church is raptured. So that really the temple part is just sort of the introduction to the main idea. So contrast that with the preterist view, which is kind of what you articulated.
Yeah. So in Luke 21, they ask about the temple, or they draw attention. There are people standing by who draw attention to the temple. And Jesus says that there's coming a day when not one stone will be left upon another. In other words, this whole temple is going to come down. That makes them want to ask, when is that going to happen? And in Luke, they say, when will these things be? And what will be the sign when these things are about to take place? And it's clear just in the context that can't be in reference to really anything other than what Jesus just said, that the temple is coming down. That's what they want to know about. When is this going to happen? And I take most of Jesus's answer, at least, going forward, to be in reference to that question, to be an answer to that question. What's interesting, and this is the way parallel passages often work. You get some things from one that you don't get from the others. Is that in Matthew 24, which is the most common version, I think, of the Olivet Discourse.
So real quick, Matthew 24 and Matthew 25, 2 chapters for the material that is in 1 chapter of Luke and 1 chapter of Mark. So it's the reason it maybe is the most common. What we mean is it seems more
gives
full,
the most detail. Yeah.
And so people who are studying it will often use it as the central part that they're focusing on because it's a little bit longer and therefore more detailed.
Yeah, but you always run into questions there in comparing parallel passages because it's a question of, do I use Matthew to interpret Luke, or do I use Luke to interpret Matthew?
Right.
And so in this case, if you look at Matthew, the disciples do ask about what could be interpreted as other things. So in Matthew's version, they say, when will these things be? Just like they do in Luke. But then they say, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? And the King James there actually has of the end of the world, which is easy to see why people would read that and get the sense that, this is something bigger than just destruction of the temple. This is the end of all things. And so you can look at the Greek word there for world, or what's translated as age in the ESV. What will be your sign of the end of the age? It's the Greek word aion, which you can kind of hear our word eon there. And so it can mean age. It can mean world as you look at how it's used in the New Testament. And so there's a little bit of an interpretation question there. But as I think of it, in terms of which gospel should interpret which, and really it's always a mutual back and forth between gospels. I think it's not like, oh, we're going to pick Luke because we just think Luke's better than Matthew. It's not that. But
it is because we're in Luke right now.
Yeah. So we are in Luke, and so that is our focus. But if you look at it in Luke, they do, it seems, clear to me that they're only asking about what Jesus says about the temple.
Yeah.
And so given that what Jesus goes on to say after that question in Luke is pretty much the same, more or less, there are differences, but it's generally the same as what he says in Matthew. I take that to mean that that three-part question in Matthew was really just more or less three ways of asking the same question. What will be the sign of your coming? Could very easily, in my opinion, mean what is the sign of that Jesus will be coming in judgment against Jerusalem, or what will be the sign of the end of the age? That was an end of the age when the destruction of Jerusalem happened. It was a repudiation of the whole system of Judaism that existed at that time, and so the Bible kind of talks about, in the New Testament, there's kind of an overlap, it seems, between the end of the old and the coming in of the new. And so it's very easy to interpret what the disciples say there is what is the end of the age? When will the old age come to pass, leading way to the new age? And so anyway, there's as I read how it reads in Matthew, I can see a little bit more of the reasons why someone would get a futurist idea in coming to this passage. And there's some legitimacy to it, I think. But at the end of the day, I'm still convinced that there's something more simple going on here. At least that Jesus is focusing on primarily the destruction of the temple that would take place in 70 AD.
That's
but
right.
There is more to it, and we'll get there. But what do you have to say about
No,
any of
I
that?
agree. So it seems to me that another way to frame this is, if you're a futurist, you say the things Jesus is talking about in Luke 21 or Matthew 24 and 25 have not been fulfilled, not primarily.
Mm-hmm.
If you're a preterist, you say they have been fulfilled. Like, this is all of these promises, we can look at them and say, yep, Jesus did this already. Or these things have happened and Jesus was right, which is clearly the position you took. You said at the end of your sermon, one of the takeaways of this is that it is a demonstration of Jesus as a true prophet who predicted the future, and it did come to pass. I would add that I think a lot of people who both of us tend to, I think, appreciate would say that it is true that it has been fulfilled, but we don't mean that it is going to have no more future implications.
Right.
And so
yeah.
let me read, and you said this in effect in your sermon, but let me read. This is what Tom Schreiner, a New Testament scholar, says, and I think we'll agree with this, but it might need some explanation. He says, we should likely see a typological connection between the judgment on the temple and the end of the world. The same principles apply. Just as the destruction of the temple cannot be calculated from world events, neither can the end of the world be discerned by the reading of the signs and the times. So, and he'll go on and say it's not just that way, but that's one way that there's a similarity. What is typology?
Typological, yeah.
Yeah, typological. What is typology or typological connection? And how would that influence the way we read this passage?
Yeah. I think when, just in ordinary language, when we speak of something as typical, what we mean is there's a pattern that goes on. You see it often, again and again. And so in a more technical sense, when we're reading the Bible and we talk about types, and I think actually Peter uses that at one point where he's talking about Noah's Ark, I believe, and he says these things were types of things to come. But anyway, what we're referring to is usually something in the Old Testament that has reference to something, to a reality that is bigger and greater in the New. I mentioned the story of the Exodus in the Old Testament. I mentioned that in my sermon on Sunday, that event was, one, a historical event that really happened, that God brought the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt, out of their bondage and slavery. But it is also typological in the fact that it's a type of the greater salvation that God would accomplish through Christ and through the shed blood of Christ. And so that's one example, but there are many we could point to that Adam himself, the first man, was a type of the second Adam who would come later in Christ. Or the story of Joseph in many ways just mirrors who Christ is. And, you just see this pattern. You see this typical thing in the Old Testament where something that comes before is a type or a picture of something that comes after. And so the relevance that has here is that we can also understand the passage typologically or typologically, that yes, this is in its most direct and literal sense a prophecy that is about the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, but it can also be and should also be read as a type of the final judgment that is to come. So typology.
You just
helps us here.
That was awesome. You just blew my mind because you just helped me see the way words work in a way that's like everything's become much more simple to me. And I'm embarrassed that it's never dawned on me until just now. Typological is such a big fancy word. And I always I hate to say it, but it is really just a slightly fancier version of a word we use all the time, typically. Right?
Mm-hmm.
It's the same thing. So whenever I say, what time
Nobody thinks you're being fancy and smart when you say typical.
What time is Cannon coming home? Well, typically she gets home around 3. Yeah. That means there's a pattern. There is something that has happened in the past that has a predictive effect on the future that we can look at. It doesn't mean that there's a prediction promise, right? That, well, she has promised she'll be home at 3. It means that the patterns, the past provides a pattern by which we predict the future. Yeah, we used to talk about that all the time. And what we say about the Old Testament is that many of the things that are talked about as a fulfillment of the Old Testament, right? When the Bible says Jesus did this in order to fulfill the Old Testament, it does not always look like a prediction when you go back and read the Old Testament passage. Instead, it looks more like a pattern. Oh, we saw this and we saw this and we saw this. And Jesus is like that pattern, but he's a fuller version, a bigger version. And so it's a normal thing in the Bible for there to be patterns in the Old Testament that work themselves out in a similar but fuller way in the New Testament. And so all we're saying about this passage is that it is reasonable to assume that the passage that is describing the temple being destroyed as a act of the judgment of God and the day of the Son of Man, that day of the Lord type of language that describes the temple, can be fulfilled, can be a prediction that is fulfilled and still have future implications as a pattern that will be played out again. I think that this is so simple, and there's great reason to read it that way, and it just seems obvious to me.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think maybe what it will come to on a practical level in terms of how you read this is if you see it as more typological, like what you just described, then there's less reason, it seems to me, to get fixated on the details of the passage and what is said as having some specific reference to the end somewhere or eschatology. So you could read this and think, we need to see very particular things happen in Jerusalem as we get close to the second coming of Christ. And it can kind of fuel a lot of speculation about very specific things. And I think that's what you see oftentimes in a system like dispensationalism. And I think from my part, I would be willing to say, you know what, you might be right. We might see stuff like that. But I'm not willing to say that I know things are gonna occur that are like that. But I do know that on the level of principle, I am called to be watchful and to wait eagerly, to not be led astray, to not be terrified by the things that I see going on around me. Those are the kind of the big picture principle things that I take from this passage and absolutely apply it to my situation and our situation today as we wait for the ultimate coming of Christ when he comes again and puts everything right and makes everything new. So there is application to that, I believe.
Yeah, great. So where do we go from there? It seems to me that what we've done is kind of laid out so far big general umbrella ways of viewing the passage. It might help from here to walk into some of the more specifics. I don't want to get all the way into the weeds, and I don't want you to feel like you have to re-preach your sermon, but just where would some of the major points be, and let's cover some of the high points maybe, and points of discussion. One thing I think might be helpful to do is talk about, if you are a preterist like you and I are, one of the things that would be significant for us is to let people feel the weight of the destruction of the temple itself. Right? So this isn't like, hey, there's just going to be a building that's going to be knocked down. Like, you're talking about something that will radically change the life of every Jewish person forever, right? This is a monumental act of judgment. So I think it would be helpful to establish a little bit about why the temple was so significant. You did this, but let's just kind of maybe review it just briefly.
Yeah.
What makes the temple such a big deal?
It's the center of religious life in Judaism, where sacrifices were performed, where pilgrimages were made. If you lived somewhere else, you always made a pilgrimage at least once a year to Jerusalem. And we were talking about it the other day, and you really painted the picture very well of how this is something that would have been kind of like we have all our Christmas traditions today that we just love and do, singing songs and decorating the tree and reading the Christmas story and all these things. They would have had those kinds of experiences with, traveling to the temple each year, and the songs you would sing on the way there, and the just beauty and grandeur of the temple as you beheld it, being on par with one of the wonders of the world, of the ancient world at that time. But and so this is very significant. And the analogy to something like 9/11 in our context was one that was in my mind the whole time I was prepping the sermon, but I don't think I ever made the connection in the sermon, though I meant to. And just thinking, as we think about something in our context like 9/11 and that event, and just the horror of it, and the way it shook us as a culture, and the way it shook the world, really, that is something analogous to what we're talking about here, but it still doesn't reach that level, I don't think. I don't think it is even right all that close, even though it's the closest thing that I can come to. I mean, just talking about death toll, it's not like we're trying to minimize anything here, but with 9/11, I think there was around 3,000 who were killed. With even the smallest estimates that you read of the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in 70 AD was somewhere between 20 and 30,000. Right. Ancient historians I think Tacitus said 600,000.
So let me read Josephus. Or this is a commentary.
1.1 million. Sorry, spoiler.
This is Josephus being summarized. Josephus, known for exaggerating numbers, so this commentary is saying it may be larger than this.
Good start.
Josephus, by the way, is a Jewish historian, but he has been hired by the Roman government to write a history of the Jews being conquered by the Romans to sort of glorify the Romans. So that's why.
Interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting. So he is kind of eyewitness, but he's hired by Tacitus to Flavian, I think, not Tacitus. He's hired by Flavian to describe it. So you expect him to make Flavian look awesome in the writing. That said, or at least awesome from a Roman perspective, not from a Jewish perspective. Josephus, known for exaggerating numbers, puts the tally of the Jews killed by the Romans at 1.1 million. He claims that the captives led away to be displayed in Rome and sent off as slaves to various provinces and Egyptian mines numbered 97,000. So in addition to those murdered, which is 1.1 million, another almost 100,000 are led off in war procession and then eventually sold off or distributed as slaves. Says he gives gruesome account of the starvation of those during the siege of Jerusalem. He claims that one mother took her baby from her breast and killed it and roasted it for food. I won't keep going on, but just like this massively insane amount of suffering. And like you said, this is, for me, I had never been to the World Trade Center. And I had never been to the Pentagon. So I know they're significant in our culture, and any attack on American soil was a crazy thing. But it's not like I was making pilgrimages to those places every year my life. We didn't sing songs about them. We didn't travel. There weren't holidays built around it. Every single Jew traveled a minimum of once a year. On your 12th birthday, like Jesus does, around that year, you go and spend a week in Bible school learning to become a adult male or adult female so that you're ready to, enter Jewish culture. But you do that at the temple. Some people went multiple times a year for other feasts. This was the central bank. So all of their money is tied up in the temple. It had been come by the investments of Herod. People say, equivalent to one of the 7 wonders of the world. From a distance, they said it was so shiny that as you're pilgrimaging up the mountain, you can see it way off in the distance. And I think it's Josephus who said people found it hard to look at because it was so reflective of the sun. The polished gold and the polished marble was so reflective. It was like looking into a mirror that was reflecting the sun back in. From a side view, it looks like a snow-capped mountain, but bright, amazing. They talk about all the gold, this is just huge to them. Beyond that, it represents God's blessing with their people, right? So it's like, this is where God lives. This is the glory of the Lord is in this house, and this house represents the glory of the Lord. And to destroy the temple it decimates it. I know that we're saying that those numbers are high. What did you say that the population of Baker County is in, like the 20 to 30 million range? Or
not million.
100,000.
Yeah.
20
can't remember.
to 30,000 range.
Yeah,
right?
I think that's more or less analogous to the population of either McClenny or Baker County as a whole. I can't remember.
Anyway, what we're saying here is that something like 5 times Baker County is possibly killed. And even 4 times or some less than that is sold into slavery. I mean, you're talking about a massive amount of people that are destroyed. The building that represents the relationship with God is destroyed. The success of God in the nation seems to be destroyed. The destruction of the temple is a identity shattering event. It is a wild event. Now, for Christians, I'm especially thinking of Peter. Peter is going to say this isn't just an act of judgment. It's actually a replacement of what God is doing in the world. So that there is, it's not simply that this building has fallen down. What's actually happening is that the temple itself is, the glory of God departs. So you remember in Samuel when the ark is stolen and Eli says that the glory of the God is departed. It's Ichabod, and he names his son Ichabod, and then he dies. That Ichabod is basically the glory of God is departed. And according to Peter, that now Jesus becomes the cornerstone of the temple, and you and I, Christians in general, become living stones that are being built up as a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices. The temple and all that it meant and all that it did is now no longer this building and has completely been subsumed by Christ himself and his church. And so it is it's a complete reorientation of religious life and meaning and significance. So I'm trying to weigh in the weight, or to lay on the weight of significance here. And the reason that's important for me is because people will think an accusation against our side is like, so this doesn't apply anymore. This is just like some small event, like nobody even knows what happened in 70 AD.
Yeah.
But from our perspective, my perspective, and I think yours too, is you're talking about really the end of a religious age. You're talking about the end of the old covenant and the final blow, the final destruction of the temple. As the new temple, the church, is being built up, the old temple is utterly and totally destroyed. And the monumental nature of this event really, if we don't feel like it's monumental, it's because of our place in history. It's a lack of knowledge of what the significance really was.
Yeah, just because, the death of Christ on the cross occurred at a specific point in history doesn't mean it doesn't continue to have application and meaning to us,
Right.
And so same here. I mean, this was hugely significant. And it always makes me think of, in the book of Hebrews, chapter 8, I don't have the whole context in front of me, but just chapter 8, verse 13, writer of Hebrews says, "In speaking of a new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete, and what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away." So that's where I kind of brought out that idea earlier of there being kind of a transition period going on in the New Testament where the old is ready to pass away and is coming to an end while the new is emerging simultaneously.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. So I do think this is one of the things that's worth thinking about in this passage, and a lot of prophetic things is there does seem to be ages where events are sort of overlapping. So when does the old covenant pass away and the new covenant begin? And when is the end of the Jewish age and the beginning of the church age and all of those things? And I think that sometimes we try to put the stamp. It's like, when did the United States begin? Is it the signing of the Declaration of Independence? Is it the end of the Revolutionary War? Is it so what do you date as the most significant date? The reality is that's a historian's approach to try to get a thing to wrap our head around, but it's all a web that is connected, and America exists because of the entire web. In the same way, Christianity is the death and the resurrection of Christ, the act of Pentecost in which the Holy Spirit is sent to the church and fills the church and it grows. But it does seem to be like the final death blow, the final nail in the coffin of the old covenant is the destruction of the temple. And there is now no more even semblance or resemblance of the glory of God left in the nation of Israel in the temple, that God is inhabiting the church, and that is his temple. And so I view them as all connected as the beginning of the church age. I don't have any issue if you say, well, I think the beginning of the church age is Pentecost. And well, I think that's the beginning of the church age too. They're all part of that web of the beginning, the end of the old and the beginning of the new. They all kind of are together there.
Good.
All right.
So what kind of things are you thinking about in terms of what's still to come in the passage? Is there anything there, that sticks out to you that, is interesting, or that you can kind of preview of what's coming on this Sunday?
So there is not a single thing in this passage that I would look at and say that hasn't happened yet.
Okay.
So this is what would set me different than John MacArthur. I believe that every single bit of this, we would say, has been fulfilled.
So all the way through verse 36, which is where the discourse kind of ends.
Right.
Okay. So you'll start at 25. I mean, you might dip back into my passage. I don't know. But in terms of where I stopped, you would start at 25 and then go all the way through the end of the chapter.
That's right. Now, so I still believe it all has future implications.
Sure.
And who knows, by the end of my week studying this week, I might say, well, I didn't see that, or, you know, I might change.
Yeah, I know
where
that feeling.
I stand right now, I do find this to be a legitimately challenging passage. And one of the challenges is that there are so many different views. Some of them are wildly different, but some of them are just slightly different takes. And that you would like, within the preterist idea, there's like all of these views within that, and within the futurists, there's all of these views. And so as you're trying to lay them all side by side and evaluate them and come up with your own view, it does feel a little bit overwhelming to me. I've already read a ton, and I feel like I could read for 2 more weeks and not think that I've really exhausted the data.
You were telling me earlier about 7 different views for one statement that Jesus makes in verse 32 about the generation that wouldn't pass away.
Yeah. So actually, let's talk about that verse. That might be interesting. And so,
not to get ahead of you or anything, go wherever you want.
No, that might be good. I don't know that I don't have a outline of our conversation in my head, so I'm not trying to take it somewhere. So one of the issues that really makes me lean in the preterist direction is verse 32. It says, "Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass until all has taken place." So the question is, what is all has taken place, and what is this generation, right? So who is this generation, and what are the things that have to take place in order for this thing to be fulfilled? It seems to me that all has taken place is referring to the destruction of the temple, right? So I don't, and this generation is the generation of people listening to Jesus. So Jesus, I think, is speaking in around 33 AD. Within 40 years, the temple is destroyed. And Jesus is saying that within the lifetime of most of the listeners, within a generation, which is 40 years, this is all going to take place. That makes sense. And so all of this that we're talking about, I think, is fulfilled. All has taken place by the end of 70 AD, by 70 AD. If you view it differently, you would have to say, if all that is taking place is the end times, then this generation would have to mean something other than the people who were listening to Jesus at the time, right? Which there are, like that's the verse you were saying, there's 7 different views of what this generation could mean, or what all has taken place could mean.
And I'll just say for the info of it, that there are people who, in terms of where my passage was and the way I interpreted it, it's hard to say, they would be entirely in agreement with me all the way through. They would read that part of the passage in a preterist way, but then they would see a shift occur at verse 25, where it seems like to them that Jesus is moving more into something that is more cosmic and final in nature, that is about his second coming at the end of the world. And they would see that shift happen in there at 25. There are others who would say that the shift happens at somewhere around verse 34, where he begins to talk about, watch yourselves, lest your hearts be weighed down, and that day come upon you suddenly like a trap, for it will come upon all who dwell on the face of the whole earth. So there are certain phrases, I think, that are triggering to people, not in like a bad sense, but they trigger, okay, this sounds like something future or more big and full in its scope of the whole world than just something going on in Jerusalem. Do you have any thoughts about that? Just that language of whole earth or whole world, or I forget what the others were, but
so maybe I'll do a little bit of a preview of where I'm at least leaning right now. You know, like we said, I have a few more days before I could change my mind, but I don't think I will.
Or the coming of the Son of Man, with power and great glory. That was another one on my mind.
Okay, right. That's all connected. So in Luke, starting in verse 25, there's all these signs. Sun and moon and stars on earth, they distress of nations, perplexity, the roaring of the waves and seas. So I won't go into it all now, but I have a commentary by R.T. France on the Gospel of Matthew that is going through this passage, same basic idea in Matthew. And he spends several pages talking about how sun, moon, stars, earth are used in the Old Testament to represent nations and shakings of nations and things of that. So he is not looking at it purely as a reference to actual celestial bodies, but as symbolic to the shaking of a national thing. And so ultimately it is political upheaval is happening here in this. That doesn't mean that it won't also include some star signs, because ancient people often they watched the stars and believed that it had political significance, right? I mean, so you saw that to some degree with the birth of Jesus, that these people said, oh, we saw a star, so it must be this star. It means a king is born, and they travel to see him. But that's this connection. And so what's happening there in verse 26 is that all of those things, what is coming in the world, is related to, in my understanding in verse 26, the powers of the heavens that are being shaken. And so I think that there is a reorienting of the powers of heavens. Again, this is just my view I'm saying right now, is that we are moving from an age in which it seemed like God's chosen people were the nation of Israel, and the nations were given over to the evil one. And at this point in time, what's going to happen is that God is going to begin gathering his elect from the four corners of the earth. You see this especially in the way Matthew's reference here is. So let me go read what it says in Matthew. They will see the Son of Man coming, and he sends out his angels with a loud trumpet, and they gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heaven to the other. And so I essentially think that what it's talking about is that the end of the temple is the beginning of the church age, by which the gospel goes out to the ends of the earth, and people from every tribe, tongue, and nation are being gathered into the kingdom of God. And that this is what is meant by the shaking of the nations, or the shaking of the powers that are in heaven, that there's a reorienting, that the Son is taking his throne, he's putting his foot on the nations, he is ruling them he is shattering the nations like shards of pottery, he's ruling them with a rod of iron. I think all of this kind of language is being worked into here, to which he has taken dominion over the earth. And I see this as happening at the beginning of the church age. This is the age of the Gentiles, so to speak, but it is both the Gentiles who are at fault in some ways. They're the nations that are attacking the people of God. And at the same time, God is going to take from these nations his own chosen race, royal priesthood, holy nation, and make from them the kingdom of God. I see that as the Son of Man exercising judgment on Israel, not just the nation, but the religion, the old covenant, the whole thing, and a shaking of the order of the whole world, by which he inaugurates the church and he draws all men to himself.
I think
inaugurates at the destruction of the temple. Does that make sense?
That sun, moon, and stars language, I think, is people often point back to the Old Testament prophets and how they would use similar language of judgments coming upon nations, that the sun would be darkened or the moon would lose its light, things like that, that are you might say, somewhat similar to how we still today talk metaphorically of events that are earth-shattering or that the sky is falling.
Right.
And so I think that could tie in as well and be part of what's happening there. Were you saying that the cosmic realities like sun, moon, and stars are actually references themselves to nations? Was that what you were meaning?
I think it's all, it's figurative language. So, you and I have talked a little bit about this before. I think I have a more heavy-handed view of spiritual forces in the heavenly places that have dominion over nations and earth, right? So I see that as a big theme. And so to me, the sun, moon, and stars, those things have angelic reference often. They're the powers in heavens. They're being shaken. So it is a earthly kingdom. It has earthly and heavenly dimensions because of the way I understand the nations being given over to the sons of God and angelic forces. And so I see it as a both and rather than an even either or. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And also I've heard the coming of the Son of Man in this context connected back to Daniel 7, where Daniel sees the vision, behold, with the clouds of heaven, there came one like a son of man. And he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And usually the point is made that this could be in reference to Christ's ascension into heaven that happens at the beginning of the book of Acts, that is when he comes before the Ancient of Days and is presented in heaven as the king and seated at the right hand of God.
So that's exactly right. So RT France, I think, is where I'll read to you. I hope I'm getting the right thing. Let me read this real quick. Yeah, so let me read from RT France. This is out of his Matthew commentary. He says, we have seen at chapter 10:23 of Matthew how the imagery of Daniel's vision requires that these passages be interpreted not of a coming to earth at the Parousia. Parousia is the second coming, but a coming to God in heaven to be given the universal dominion declared in Daniel 7:14. So when you see the Son of Man coming in the clouds, he says, you're not seeing him coming back in the clouds. You're seeing him coming to the Ancient of Days in the clouds. And that it is meant to be framed that you would read that, oh, this is Daniel 7 being fulfilled. He is now coming before the Ancient of Days, and the Ancient of Days, God the Father, is giving him dominion over the nations to rule them with a rod of iron. Rod of iron is Psalm 2 that I'm talking about, but this is the idea that's happening. The shaking of the powers, the Son of Man coming is all the Daniel 7 language by which Jesus Christ is gaining dominion over the world by virtue of his death and resurrection. It's also the Revelation 6, and they're like, who's worthy to open these scrolls? And they see this one who's like a lamb, but he's also like a lion. He's the Lion of Judah who has the appearance of a lamb, and he shows up, and they're like, only he is worthy. And it's a figurative language is being used, but it's also a reference, I think, to this event of the resurrection of Christ, ascension of Christ, the destruction of the temple, the shaking of the powers of the nations, and the dominion of the earth being given to him. I view this as related to the passage that you preached not that long ago, where Peter makes his confession, and Jesus says, based on this confession, the gates of, I'm giving you the keys to the kingdom, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it, essentially. So that basically the shaking of the nations is the church being given dominion, and hell is going to start losing, essentially, that the spread of the gospel is going to begin. And that does not mean that it will just slowly fade away. There still seems to me, as we've talked earlier, about a conflict that is still to come. There's a tribulation. This tribulation for Israel seems typological of tribulation that is still to come. However, I do think that this is talking about Daniel 7 and basically a new world order in which the King of Heaven is taking back dominion over the nations. so that every knee will bow. So that we could say, go into all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. All the nations are now coming under Christ. That's what I think is happening, and I think the destruction of the temple is a sign of the end of one age and the beginning of this age in which Christ rules the nations.
Very good. Christ is king.
So
is the big picture takeaway.
Yeah, I think that's the big picture takeaway. I do still think that so here's the charge that I think a futurist would say, this is the problem with you guys. It's like, it's all done, so it doesn't apply anymore. For instance, you had in your passage this idea of not preparing, right? So you don't settle it therefore in your minds, not to meditate beforehand how to answer. For I will give you a mouth and wisdom, and none of your adversaries will be able to withstand or contradict. So if I'm preterist and I say all of this is done, then that seems to be the age of the apostles. They're being arrested. All these, like Stephen, I think you brought up, the apostles are being arrested. They're brought before the emperors and Pilate and all these guys, and they have to give their testimony. And Jesus is saying, I will be with them. They don't have to be ready. So is that a promise for them only?
Yeah, and I think it seems to me at the most basic level, this is a question you have to answer when reading and applying the Bible, because we all have the book of Acts. We can all read it and see and learn and know what happened historically with the apostles and how they preached the gospel with courage and with faith. And none of us, though, would think that, that was just a historical record of what happened to them. It doesn't have any relevance to me. No, we look at them as examples for us to apply in our own life. Now, it is not always clear to what extent and to what degree those things might apply. There will be times when you read about something that happens in the book of Acts, and there will be a debate on whether that should be interpreted as normative for all time or still applying to us as the church today.
Right.
But we all in general think, yes, this is a historical event, but it's one that has something to teach me and has example for me to follow. So just at least on that very basic level, I think we can say the same about this passage too. But maybe even more than that too. And I don't know all the best language to put on it, but I just don't.
That's my view.
I'm not convinced by the charge that this a preterist reading makes it not relevant at all to our day.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add to that. I think you said it really well. It seems to me clear that what Jesus is saying when he says, settle it therefore in your minds, and many of the things that we'll talk about this coming Sunday that are the same thing, knowing that this judgment's coming, how are you going to behave, applies in a specific judgment that's coming on 70 AD. But it also applies to Christians who are living in continued tribulation and continued suffering in this world. And that these principles still rule how we think and act. That just seems very kind of self-evident to me. And I'll give you an example of this, that anyone before 70 AD would have looked at Jesus' words here and said, clearly that's what Paul is doing, right? He's able to go in and God has given him a mouth to represent Christianity. That's what Stephen did. That's what these guys are doing. Now, at the destruction of the temple, persecution of Christians did not stop. Right. So you still get led into to a Colosseum or fed to lions, and your family is still being dispersed and scattering all across the world. I think they would look at this and say that was applying before the destruction of the temple, but if I get thrown to the lion's den, am I
not encouraged by this passage?
Is it not the same God? Is that not a type? Is that not typically God has done this way, and so this is going to apply to
Yeah.
me. And so for you and I think this is where we're going to get when we get to the later verses, and starting in like really 29 and especially 34, we believe that we're still living in the cares of this life, the heaviness, the tribulations of this world. And it's still true that we have to watch ourselves, and like, you don't drink away your problems, but you live in such a way that you can give testimony to the goodness of God, and that you believe that he will return, that he will set things right.
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of takes us all the way back to Proverbs 22 that we were in this morning, or when we started, where the rich and the poor will all stand before the God who made them both. And so it is the wise person who thinks about the consequences down the road. It is the simple person who drinks his cares away and says, there's no consequences to come. That applied in a very particular way to the people who were living before the destruction of the temple. But it applies to all of us in a really similar way as we await the final day in which Christ comes to destroy all evil.
No doubt. Agree with all that.
All right. I mean, I hope this helps people who are thinking, all right, that sounds different. Where are we coming from? I think the other thing maybe that I would say, if I were sort of on the fence of this and I was wrestling through this, it would probably be for me questions about the signs in the sky, what's going on with the stars and the moons, and am I being too metaphorical with that? And I think that's a fair question to ask. And then maybe questions about wars and rumors of wars and things like that would be another issue that I would wrestle with. It's interesting that in John MacArthur's commentary, he said he has a long section on all the wars and rumors of wars that would have been predating the destruction of the temple. And he says, yeah, that was there. That was right. But think about how much more so the wars and the rumors of wars will be at the coming of Christ. And so what he does in that passage is says, he frames it differently. He says, clearly this is looking forward to the Great Tribulation, the wars and rumors of wars that will predate that. But certainly we had those things at the destruction of the temple too. So all that I'm having to do is reverse the order and say that this is actually talking about those wars and rumors of wars. And what John MacArthur is saying will be bigger and greater is, for me, I can just say amen. But that's going to be true because of typology, not because Jesus was looking past the temple in this prediction.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And so
everybody seems to agree that these are actually things that happen all the time, that we see all throughout history.
That's right.
You know?
That's right. So for me, and that's why actually, even though I don't agree 100% with MacArthur's take on this, I actually still find his commentary helpful, and we're not as far off as some people might think. Like, well, you're wildly over here and he's wildly over here. Yeah. Because I believe in the way God works in typical behavior, that God works in patterns. I expect to see parallels, and I expect me to be able to read him and say, amen. Yeah, I agree with that.
We're all driving to the same destination, but just like debating on how the car should be put together or something. I don't know. I'm just making up that analogy as I go.
I get what you're saying, right? And so, I don't know. I think it is helpful to say that even if you, as one of the people listening to this, many people in our church who I'm assuming will say, I wasn't convinced there. I'm still more on Team MacArthur than Joel and Nathaniel. I won't be offended that
it's hard to compete. It's hard to compete with MacArthur.
I won't be offended that you don't agree. I could say, well, it's not just Team Joel and Nathaniel. What about R.C. Sproul, who's more like us? Or what about this guy? People I respect are on multiple sides of the issue. And I want to kind of end, or at least if we're not all the way done, close to it, by saying that very godly people view this differently in some of the particulars. And MacArthur and Sproul were the best of friends, and we should be able to be too, even if you're kind of not sure that you're going to go the same direction as me when you interpret what is nation against nation, or what is the stars falling refer to. There's some hard things here, and we may not be quite as far apart as you think we are.
We're all living in the expectation of Christ's return, and
We're all living there,
waiting eagerly with patience and faith and watchfulness and
I think we all believe, because we believe in the patterns of Scripture, that whether this was partially fulfilled and will come about later in a bigger way, which is more of the MacArthur way, or whether we think this was fully fulfilled, but we expect patterns of behavior, both in humans and God, to continue to work out in similar ways, we're actually still similar either way. And so I don't think we're going to be punching each other at the end of the day.
Yeah.
All right. I think that's pretty good. Do you have anything else you want to add?
Good conversation. No, just looking forward to your sermon on Sunday, putting a bow on it. And it's going to be good.
On weeks coming forward, we keep telling people, let us know what you have. I think Darcy maybe was the one that mentioned doing the Sabbath, so we could start brushing up on that.
That'd be good.
I did hear on the Baker County interviewing the candidates thing, they asked what you think about Sabbath laws regarding the sale of alcohol, which I know is not what Darcy was talking about, but that might be a fun little side on our Sabbath talk. And then if there's anything else that you think, you being you, Joel, or you being anybody else in the church, say, hey, I'd really like us to talk about this. I will say that we talked a little bit about end times related stuff with regard to the destruction of the temple, but this topic is huge, and we could talk about. We might come back to this on a whole different level, the millennium or whatever. And so, if there's something about this conversation that you're like, I would have liked you to have gone this way, you can bring that up as well.
Yep.
Sound good?
Sounds good. Thanks everybody for listening, and we'll see you next time. God bless.